Okay, so as Sue said, we run a programme of events throughout the year, and we start in the spring with this event, which is really about going right back to finding your research idea and how to develop that into a question. And then as we progress throughout the year, then we talk more about design and actually writing the application. So this is the first in our series of events. And I'm going to be talking about how to find a good research idea. And then Phil's going to talk more about developing that into a question. So I should have said that we will be recording our presentations. That's so that people can watch them later if they weren't able to attend. So what I've observed from our previous events that we run this time of year is that people fall generally into two camps. So camp A is that they have a research question, often that's come from their clinical practice, something that they've noticed about their practice that they want answered, and they turn to research to think about how they can answer that. And then there's camp B, which is where people don't specifically have an idea or a question, but they know that they want to get involved in research, or they've been encouraged to get involved in research by their manager or their department. And so they're looking for a question to answer. And usually I would ask for a show of hands, but it's a little trickier when we're on the Teams. But I'm sure there's probably some of both of you here today. So what we're going to do, first of all, is look at how you might get an idea. And then we're going to look a little bit at, well, you've got an idea, but how do you know it's a good one? So that's what we'll go through now. So for most people, their research question comes from their everyday clinical practice. So, for example, you might be a physiotherapist, and you might have noticed with your patients that some people are more motivated to do their exercises that you give them than other people. And you might wonder, well, what makes some people more motivated? Or how can we help people adhere to their exercise routines when they don't seem to be doing them? Or you might have questions like, well, we've got a huge waiting list, particularly after COVID. What can we do to reduce that? Can we see people less? Can we give them exercises to do at home? Can we see them people in groups? And these might all be questions that you have that you want answering through research. But for some people, they don't have a natural question that pops up from their everyday practice. And so we're going to look at a couple of other ways that you can get some ideas for research questions. So one of those through the James Lind Alliance, which some of you might have heard of. It's an organisation which brings together patients, carers, clinicians, all people in a field, and it is a particular clinical condition. So I've got an example here of an eye condition, cataract. And so people would have been brought together, so patients with cataracts, their carers, their clinicians, and they would have been asked, what are the main questions that you want answering about cataracts? And then these would have been prioritised into this list of the 5 things that they most want answered. And now these lists exist on the James Lind Alliance website for a number of different conditions. So if you want to know what are those burning questions that people want answered, this is a website that you can check out to get some inspiration for your research ideas. Another source of ideas is the funder's own website. So many funders, as you probably know, have researcher-led calls. So that's where you as a researcher come up with the idea and the question. But they also often have themed calls where they will say, we want research done on this particular topic. And sometimes even more than that, they present their own question. So this is an example from recent NIHR website with a question that they wanted answered about the effectiveness of a particular kind of medication for depression following a traumatic brain injury. So there they've presented the question, and actually they've even given you quite a big hints about what they want in the design. So what the intervention is, what the control is, for example. So they've done quite a lot of the work for you. So it's worth looking at the funders' websites to see if they've got particular things that they want answering. And then, I'm sure you've all read a lot of papers. We often see in the conclusions that a study hasn't answered all of the questions on a topic and that further research is needed. So this is also a way that you can come up with your research ideas. So when you're reading papers or you've done your own research and there's still things that need to be answered and the authors have suggested perhaps what the next step is, this is something you can use to inspire you with your research idea. So just to recap, coming up with your ideas, you can reflect on your everyday practice, be inquisitive. What questions do you have that you think haven't been answered? Get to know the literature well in your area. So what are the next steps to build on other people's work? And then you can borrow ideas from funders like the James Lind Alliance, or from guidelines. So for example, NICE guidelines often suggest what research still needs to be done. And then you have your idea, but how do you know if it's a good idea? How do you know if it's an idea that's going to get the funder's seal of approval? Well, the first place that you need to start is thinking about whether your question has been answered. So you might come up with this really good idea, only to find out that somebody else has already answered it or is already in the process of answering it. So this is where you need to be really familiar with the literature in your area. And Rosemary's going to talk a little bit later about how you can get support with that. It's also about checking databases like registers of trials to make sure that that research isn't currently ongoing. And then what we advise is that you stick to what you know. So it's playing to your strengths, your knowledge, your research expertise. So it can be tempting, particularly if you see those questions on a funder's website where you think, oh, great, there's a question there, I'm going to answer that. But if that's really outside your area of expertise or your knowledge, then we would really advise against that, because the funders are going to be looking at why are you the best person to answer this question? Why should we give the money to you? What's your experience in this area? And then the other piece of advice is really to start small and build big. So people, when they come to us, are often really ambitious, and that's great and that's nice to see. But sometimes they can come with a real end goal in mind about what question needs answering, like a full definitive randomized controlled trial that's going to prove the effectiveness of some intervention. And that's great, because that's the kind of evidence that's needed to answer questions about effectiveness. But quite often there's some steps that need to be taken before somebody can get to that definitive RCT. So it might be that you need to do a feasibility study. So feasibility answer things like, could you recruit to a trial? Can you deliver the intervention as you think you can? So it's often that a feasibility comes before definitive RCT, and you might even need to go a step further back and do some qualitative work with patients to really find out like what the core of the problem is, what the help they think they need to address it. And so I find in my work that I'm often taking people back a step or two, so that they have that ultimate goal at the end, but what do they need to do to get there? So bear that in mind when you're thinking about what question you need to answer imminently. And then, as I say, people often come wanting to do a randomized controlled trial, and that's great. I mean, we're part of the trials unit, that's what we specialise in, but we also do other studies, and we encourage other people to think about other studies as well. So things like natural experiments. So here we've got the twin study. So twins who were born together but then reared apart is a good example of how you can answer nature-nurture questions. And if we think about things in our own world at the moment, we've obviously got COVID, which has caused a lot of chaos, but does present some opportunities for natural experiments. So if you think about interventions that might usually have been delivered in routine practice but weren't because of COVID, they can present an opportunity to study the usefulness of those interventions or whether they're necessary. So really thinking about how you can use natural experiment to help you get to the steps of doing a definitive RCT. We also encourage the use of routine data. So that's data that's collected every day in routine practice. So things like GP data, hospital data. And in Wales, this is stored on a database called the SAIL database, and you can access that. And you might be able to answer your question without collecting any new data, which can mean it's cost effective, it's less patient burden. So this is something funders really like as well. And when you've got your idea and you're developing your question, it's really important that you talk it over with people. So sadly, we don't have these water cooler moments anymore, but hopefully we will again soon. But we really recommend that you talk over your idea with people in your field, because they might tell you, oh, so-and-so is already doing that, and you're not going to waste your time going down that route. Or they might say, that's a fabulous idea. Have you thought about it from this perspective, or adding in that? We also recommend talking to people outside your field. So you can come to us at RDCS and we will help you formulate your question and then help you come up with a design to answer that question. And we also recommend that you talk to patients or the public so that you can find out if your question is an important one. Would people be willing to take part in a study that looked at what you're proposing? And some people find it helpful to keep a journal, sort of their initial inkling of an idea, and when they talk to people, how that idea builds until they've got their research question. So just to summarise then, the questions that you need to think about when coming up with your idea are: what do you need to know about your everyday practice, things that haven't been answered that you would like answered? How can you build on what's already been done? And what are funder, patient and carer priorities? And then when you have your idea, thinking about, well, has this question already been answered? Is it within your area of expertise? So that's your knowledge of your field, but also your research expertise. What steps are needed to take the idea forward, and who can you talk it over with? And that's my last slide, Richard, so you can stop recording.